Good pronunciation as well.
Right. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, thank you very much for coming along. And we are really grateful to your willingness to give us evidence to this inquiry into the EU's global approach to migration and mobility and related matters. I'll just run through some routine matters if you don't mind now. As you know, the session is open to the public. A webcast of the session goes out live as an audio transmission and is subsequently accessible via the parliamentary website. A verbatim transcript will be taken of your evidence, and this will be put on the parliamentary website. A few days after this evidence session, you will be sent a copy of the transcript to check it for accuracy, and we would be grateful if you could advise us of any corrections as quickly as possible. And if after this session you wish to clarify or amplify any points made during your evidence or have any additional points to make, you are welcome to submit supplementary evidence to us. Now, perhaps if you could introduce yourselves, and if you wish to make any opening remarks, that would be entirely welcome to the committee. If you don't wish to do so and wish to go straight on to questions, that would be welcome too. It's entirely up to you. And of course we have had circulated, and I hope read, some of the material that Openeurope has written on this matter and which are covered in the questions which, as you know, we'll be asking you. So, Mr. Persson.
Well, thank you so much, Lord Hannay, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation and for having us. My name is Persson. I am the director of Openeurope. This is our research director, Stephen Booth. The only thing I would say initially is that in our work at Openeurope, what we have primarily looked at on this question is, of course, the politics of European Union immigration policy, the interplay between what's happening at the EU level and the domestic level. We've also looked at internal immigration, free movement, and so forth, and also the EU asylum system. We haven't looked as much at the issue of third country immigration. So just keeping that in mind as we give our evidence, that our own research and our own work on this has been in those three areas primarily that I mentioned. But in addition to that, we're of course happy to share our thoughts and hopefully insights.
Well, I think, the committee is in fact covering all those areas as well that you've spoken about, because you can't sort of divide this subject up into neat parcels, although that's what legally you have to do.
Sure.
But you can't, in reality, in policy and economic terms, divide it up into completely parcels. And none of the witnesses who come to give evidence to us has done so. The Swedish minister who came gave evidence across the whole board, including asylum, including intra-migration, intra-EU migration. So we're very happy if your answers stray into that area as well. It will be thoroughly useful to us, and we're not literally taking a narrow view of migration and mobility from outside the European Union as the only thing that affects this equation.
Sure thing.
Mr. Booth, do you want to say something at the beginning, or?
And I don't have much to add to that other sort of introduce myself as the research director, and I've done a lot of work on the not just on the internal migration, we also looked at the European neighbourhood policy, which I think is quite a good example of
Could you go a little bit slower?
Sorry, yeah. I've also looked at the European neighbourhood policy, particularly in the North African region and in the Mediterranean, which I think is quite a good example of the kind of issues that we're talking about kind of in action.
Yes. But I noticed that the Openeurope study on the North African migration, which you were pretty critical about the neighbourhood policy and so on, it entirely relates to the period before the Arab awakening.
Yes.
And therefore is to some extent of more historical than practical interest, since the world we're now living in is an Arab world awakened.
Sure.
And the likely consequences for migration of that rather than of the I agree with you actually, entirely unsatisfactory situation that prevailed when these countries were ruled by autocracies and there was very widespread human rights abuses and so on. And when these countries were being used as channels for migration, which I suspect they're to a much lesser extent now because of the turmoil in them. Anyway, that's very helpful. So I think we'll go into questions now. And just to begin, I wonder if you could give us your view on the EU's global approach to migration and mobility. First of all, how well do you think it's operated to date? And then, is it an effective strategy for the future? And here I'm talking, about the communication which we've got under review, of course.
Well, I think firstly, as you mentioned, we have to look at the past experience to kind of learn from that. I think in principle it's a good idea to have greater coordination at the EU level of how you talk to third countries about the issues of legal migration, also about asylum and preventing illegal migration. But it seems to me that the fundamental problem with the idea of this global approach is that the Commission has been given this policy strategy but without the tools really to deliver on it, because the actual decisions about how many people allowed to settle in member states or come to member states still rests with the member states. So the Commission is in the position of is a difficult position of going to third countries to try and in the pursuit of dialogue without actually being able to deliver on often what is basically a two-sided deal. They're basically saying we encourage you third countries to help us with preventing illegal immigration, setting up the capacity to prevent issues around asylum and so on. And the quid pro quo is often about opening up access to the EU and increasing mobility within the EU. But it can't deliver on that second half of the bargain because that's all about member state competences. And I think that is the fundamental problem with the global approach. And I think that is something that isn't going to be changed by the new approach. I think it's the same fundamental issue it underlines.
Well, you've posed the dilemma very clearly there, and I'm sure there must be validity in that. But do you conclude from that the member states should be collectively giving the Commission more firepower, as it were, in this matter, or not?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I think politically you're seeing that there isn't much appetite for that. There is no appetite for a common immigration system among the member states. The Commission has tirelessly been trying to deliver one and push one, but it has never really got anywhere at the level of member states. If you're talking about legal migration, that's certainly true. Even if for the issue of the asylum system, the Commission has obviously been pushing this idea of burden sharing, and again, that hasn't really got anywhere in terms of the Dublin system. So you can see that the political will isn't really there among the member states, and I think that's just a fact of life. It's very difficult to change, and therefore, I think we just have to be realistic about what the Commission can ever do in terms of this idea of global approach and speaking with one voice. You have to look at the facts on the ground, and if you can't actually deliver it, it seems that you may be barking up the wrong tree, and it's slightly almost an exercise that is almost doomed to fail almost.
Could I add to that just very, very briefly? I think in theory and in principle, it does make sense to have more common measures at the EU level in the areas of immigration and asylum. So in theory, it does make sense to give the European Commission more powers over that area. Because if you have free movement internally, then it makes sense to also have more coordination and cooperation externally. I think the two should go together. But that's in theory, and as Stephen said, I think it's actually politically extremely difficult to outsource this area to the EU level, because it has such intimate links to sort of the social bargain, the bargain between a government and its electorate, immigration policy has. So if you try to do that prematurely, to outsource it prematurely to the European Union, I think we may experience a backlash. So whilst in theory we would probably think it would be a good idea, this is one of the areas where actually more Europe could be beneficial. But in practice, unfortunately, that will always come up against, as Stephen said, political realities, and trying to sort of artificially push it may create a democratic backlash. And we have to be very careful about that.
But what you call the political realities are certainly, I wouldn't disagree with you about the political realities today, but they're not necessarily the political realities of tomorrow or 5 years' time or 10 years' time.
No, quite.
When the demographic situation may have produced a completely different set of pressures. But I take your point, yes.
But I think also, I have one more thing. So on a more practical level, I think I read the Swedish minister's evidence to you, and he was very much of the view, just looking at labour migration, his view of the Swedish model was based on demand driven by the employers. So very much of these are the skills we need, therefore these are the kind of people we need. Whereas the Commission's approach is to link this idea of mobility to foreign policy, and it's much more on the supply side, therefore it's about let's do a deal with this country about labour mobility. And it's to me, those seem like competing concepts. One, the fact you have a demand-driven side of labour mobility driven by employers, whereas the Commission's view is more linking it to the idea of external action and foreign policy, which by virtue of the way that's going to work is going to be a deal with a certain country. So therefore I think that that offers again shows a competing objectives between what the member states ideally would like in terms of the labour market model they're pursuing, and what the Commission would like to do as a sort of one-size-fits-all EU speaking as one voice to the rest of the world, or particularly a third country.
Okay, Lord Mackenzie.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I think you've partly answered my question, but could you add to it by suggesting how the effectiveness of the global approach could be improved? And also, what is your view of the proposal of the most recent communication from the Commission?
Well, I think in terms of improvement, I think the only way it can ever be really effective, because I think it always will come down to this issue about we offer you something and we'll give you something in return. Therefore, I think the only way to make it really work in practice is to have, as we've said, to have some kind of offer to put to people on the table before you go to speak to them, more or less, and say that we can grant you access on these terms to these member states. Maybe it's a group of member states goes to a third country and says this is the deal we're prepared to give to you. But without that carrot, or if you like, the Commission can really use that. There's difficulty. You're always going to find it difficult to then do the other side of the coin, which is what a lot of other member states I think are really what relies behind the motivation of the member states is about the ideas of preventing illegal migration and trying to address the issues of why the push for migration in the first place, and the situation in the countries we're talking to about democratic reform, economic reform, and those kind of things. So I think without any hard cash, if you like, to put on the table from the EU side, I think it's going to be very difficult to make it effective.
Thank you.
And I don't think the Commission's proposals really address that issue.
Have you anything to add about the most recent communication itself?
Well, as I said, I don't think it does addresses that fundamental issue. I think what would concern Open Europe and probably a lot of member states is this idea of it being. It's very very clear. I think it says it talks about linking it to the EU's foreign policy and it being migrant centred, which are two things that I think member states and voters in the member states wouldn't recognise as the prime objectives of a migration policy. And I think that is the problem that it has. I don't have anything to add to that. I think that's the main.
Thank you very much.
Lord Jarl.
Open Europe has criticised what it sees as the failures in EU engagement in North Africa and Middle Eastern countries. Now, the Chairman touched on this area in his initial exchange with you, but I think it would be helpful for the committee if you could say a little bit more about the grounds for this criticism, this conclusion on your part.
Sure. I think it's a very good sort of example or case study of the kind of issues we've been talking about. I have two examples that I hope can illustrate the point that we've been making. The first one is that on the point of kind of capacity building in third countries about kind of the preventing illegal migration and trying to encourage legal migration. We looked at a migration centre that was EU funded and built in Mali with the aim of being an information centre for people seeking to enter the EU, and one of the objectives was also trying to help people do so legally. And according to the EU's documents, it cost 10 million euros, and in total only 29 million workers gained access to the EU, only 6 of which did so sort of via facilities and information provided by the centre. And the reason for that was that only Spain had a deal in place with Mali on labour migration. So it illustrates this issue about it's fine to have the approach and the policy there, but without the actual tools and the mechanisms in place to make it happen, it's never going to be effective. And then another example that I think is also that highlights another issue is that of which I think that Lord Hannay mentioned earlier about this compromising the kind of the EU's principles of human rights and so on. That we're in a situation where the EU was funding Libyan law enforcement agencies to debrief potential illegal immigrants. And I think that's another example of which illustrates the problems that the EU has faced in its approach by trying to basically prioritise this idea of basically keeping people out over kind of this is the idea that you can keep people out by granting money, huge grants of money in the idea of promoting democratic and economic reform, which I think patently failed in North Africa and those Mediterranean states, but also working with these countries on practical things like law enforcement and toughening up the borders and so on. It resulted in huge compromises on things that the EU would hold up as its major principles, like human rights and so on. And I think those two examples illustrate the kind of problems that the EU faces without this actual political willingness to actually follow through on the idea of this strategy of having dialogue, but also there's no point in having dialogue unless it's followed up with access.
Two questions.
I think what you're saying relates to the way the EU tried to deal with the Mubarak, Gaddafi and Ben Ali regimes in those 3 countries, which is a matter for historical record and which we don't need to have an argument about, because I think your study showed that it was pretty defective, both defective in effectiveness and defective in human rights terms as well. Now, we're in a different era now, which doesn't enable us to say, obviously, that all those human rights problems have simply disappeared because there have been elections in Tunisia, elections in Libya, elections in Egypt. But at least there is the hope that there will. And of course there is another factor which ought to come into play, which is that the EU's relationship with all these countries, the countries that have moved on to a democratic track, ought to be a much deeper and fuller relationship than it was previously. So, to some extent, I think if you could factor that into your answer.
I agree, but I think what you have to look at is why they dealt with the regimes. What was the driving force? And the reason, I think, that under the motive was that that without granting access, it's complicated by the fact of the nature of the regimes, but the fundamental issue is still, do you want to grant access to the people entering the EU? And if you don't want to do that, you have to deal with whatever regime you did, and we ended up dealing with some quite unsavoury people. But I think the underlying premise for that still remains. And another issue that I think is worth looking at is the opportunities. Why are these people coming, or why do these people want to come to Europe? And I think that one thing that is potentially positive is that if we can deal with more democratic regimes and so on, the scale of economic integration should be pursued in terms of boosting trade. I think that's something that also the EU failed to do with the ENP countries, is that there was still too many barriers for actually having a job in these countries and exporting your wares. Instead, the only actual solution was to leave the country and try to enter the EU. So that's another aspect of the ENP that I think failed in the previous approach.
Chairman, there have of course always been those who have questioned the policies to which you refer. They haven't always been listened to. I wonder whether I could ask you 2 questions. One is, how far you are really arguing that this misguided approach has come from within the EU professional entity, or how far it is the result of policies of individual member countries, and how far they are prepared to go in a common approach. Secondly, whether in fact what is happening is a failure in strategic leadership, a failure to spot that Europe's interests lie with the people of the future, and that while human rights and all this matter tremendously, it's also a matter of being realistic about what is actually going to prevail and making sure one's coming to terms with this and easing the new future in with as little disruption as possible. There will be disruption, but as little as possible.
Yeah.
Two very good questions. I think that on the where the failure lies or laid, I think it is the problem fundamentally, as we touched upon, is that when you have 27 member states lumped together, there will be very diverging views on what the common approach should look like. And the ENP fell into that trap. It tried to do far too many things because it tried to sort of meet far too many member states' sort of preferences or demands or links to various parts of its neighbourhood. And in trying to achieve so many different things, it ended up arguably achieving none of them, none of the objectives. That was a problem. So I think there needs to be some sort of sediment. If you look specifically at the ENP, what exactly do you want to achieve through that policy? You have to pick a couple of key objectives and then go for them. You cannot achieve everything. It's not realistic. So I do think the failure, we shouldn't blame the European Commission too much for the failure. I think it was a result of member states having far too many different views on what the ENP should be. And I mean, and the Mediterranean Union is sort of a key example of what the EU should not be doing, trying to sort of have a halfway house to kind of appease southern member states, but that halfway house doesn't achieve anything at all. It's only confusing. That one could be scrapped altogether. It just shows that you need to inject some policy substance into what you do, not to have sort of a token measures. So, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think on the second point about strategic vision, I think you're right. But the question is, I think that has to come from the member states. Really, I think that you can't expect the Commission to have a strategic vision for the EU in terms of kind of external relations. That has to be from the member states, and I think that comes down to this issue about EU foreign policy on the one hand, and also just member states' issues about immigration on the other. I mean, the UK obviously has cultural links to other parts of the world that are much stronger than to the North African and Mediterranean. So its discussions, the UK's discussions about immigration are probably going to tend to focus on the subcontinent and so on, rather than North Africa and the Mediterranean. If you're talking about kind of issues about are we getting enough young people who are willing to do work and so on. Obviously, the Mediterranean is still a huge foreign policy issue, and the UK will have an interest in that, as Libya showed. Whereas for countries like France and Italy, it's both, because they probably have closer links to these countries on a cultural level and a historical level.
Chairman, if I may, you're mentioning cultural, but wouldn't you say that one of the would you say, I don't want to go a leading question, but would you say that one of the great difficulties has also been that a number of member states have very specific economic interests in the existing regimes in the short term, and that this has been a driving force in what's gone wrong?
Well, yeah, I think that was obviously key when you kind of saw the links between some of the regimes and figures in the member state governments and so on. I think that's true. I think that will remain to be the case. I mean, that's one of the problems with EU foreign policy more fundamentally, is that you're always going to have those issues. And I think that's the difficulty with the Commission has with linking foreign policy and immigration, when I think Britain's interests are going to be different to those around the Mediterranean on both those issues. So you're mixing up a whole host of different questions in one document, which is also looking at 4 different types of immigration. or migration. So it seems to me like a very confused document, which doesn't seem like it's going to, and given that, it seems very unlikely that it's going to resolve any of the issues it raises.
It's a very confused document. It's a very confused situation the document is trying to deal with.
Sure, you know, it's not an easy question.
You said a little earlier that the EU, and particularly the Commission, should pick 2 key objectives and go for them. Which ones?
The
Which
EMP,
ones?
the EMP policy in particular, I think they should go on the EMP specifically. They should target trade first and foremost. Trade, absolutely. I think that is one of the key areas where the EU actually can make a difference, because the Commission, remember, the Commission, that's an area where the Commission actually has a very strong level of competence. So that's where the Commission can act.
Trade. Well, the second.
The second one I would think would be.
Well, I think it probably has to. If you're looking at it from a migration perspective, and it depends on your objective. But I would say, if given what appears to me to be the motivation for most of this, which is actually preventing illegal migration, I think if you can boost trade and at the same time boost the enforcement and the kind of the border issues, those would seem to me to be fulfilling the main objective that seems to me to be underlying the idea of the EMP in the first place.
So what we should be doing is pursuing a...
I could just insert this at this stage. If the EU could, together with other Western donors, do something about the skills levels in these countries, at the same time as helping them through trade concessions to increase their trade, that would both provide a higher level of skilled labour within those countries to meet demands of economic growth, but also would it perhaps mean that some of the migrants were more qualified than they are now.
You mean funding education?
Yes, that's right. Funding vocational training and things like that.
I think in theory that's a very good idea. Again, it comes back to what realistically can be achieved. If you look at the scale of the funding needed for that to have an effect, I just don't think EMP is big enough. But I do think you can have targeted funding at certain segments of society in those countries. Right. And that should be vocational training. It should also be aid for trade facilitation.
Yeah. But it's also
Lord Richard, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
I just want to be clear about the sort of, the package.
Well, I think it's a question.
Can I just put the question?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. It seems to me that what you're saying to us is that the EU should have a positive policy in trying to encourage a defensive strategy in relation to the borders of the EU. In other words, that you try and stop the illegal migrants coming in. In addition to that, at the same time, we should be doing something to encourage trade and activity between the exporting countries, if I can use that rather horrid phrase, and the EU. And also we should be trying to do something for education inside the countries that are sending people out, so that the people that they do send out, the ones that the EU is prepared to accept, are better qualified to do the skilled jobs that they want to do. Now, is that the broad package?
Well, can I just qualify that? What I meant was that if you're, I think the first question is, what is the objective? Do you want the people to stay there, or do you want them to come to the EU? I think that's a fundamental question.
You want the right people to come.
Well, exactly, but that's difficult, isn't it? I think it seems to me that
Sorry, I don't believe that for a second. I mean, if you actually scratch the surface with the individual member states and say, yes, of course we want migrants, but we want the right sort of migrants to fit our economy and fit our development. So they've got to be skilled. We say that, the French say that, everybody says that.
No, I agree, but I think what the EMP was trying to do, in my view, was it was trying to prevent people coming, and through funding and through other issues. I think if you're trying to meet that objective, in terms of combating the illegal migration, which I know it's difficult to separate them, but if you can think of that in that concept, I think the best way of doing that is to improve the situation in the host country, which is through trade and through education and the issues we talked about. And the second issue about selecting a filter mechanism for getting the right people into the EU, I think that's a much more complicated issue. But I think that those are two separate objectives. But if you can agree that those are the two objectives of your policy, it's then choosing the policies or the tools to meet those two different objectives. And I think the first one, the EMP failed hugely because it was just throwing the money at the issue and not actually improving the situation in the countries. which we think that a bigger focus on trade would have done a better job on that. I think the second question is much more complicated, and it's not something that we've done a detailed look in terms of the policies that you would use to meet that. But as I said earlier, I think that one of the problems with us meeting the second objective about getting the highly skilled people in is that it seems to me that the Commission's approach and the employer-led demand approach seem to be in conflict, and I think that's a difficult thing to resolve.
Well, given this conflict and the inability of the European Union to intervene in what are member state competencies, do you think that the EU can really hope to achieve anything through instruments such as the mobility partnerships and common agendas on migration and mobility, which are included in the GAM? And should the balance between the EU and member states be changed, and if so, in which direction?
I think that goes back what we said. Goes back to what we said earlier. I do think it is a very difficult ask, and it will be politically very difficult to achieve. So, at the moment, I don't think anything substantial can be achieved at the EU level on these issues. As Lord Hannes said, that may change in future. It may come to a situation where there's more political appetite for having more common measures at the EU level. We don't know. But at the moment, we just have to be a bit realistic about what this possibly can achieve. But I do think that the voluntary approach could be a positive thing. If you sell this as a voluntary thing that selected member states can take part of if they want to, and start to pool resources and so forth, and take more decisions in common and have more joint measures, I think that could possibly serve as a positive example for to follow. So in other words, you can sort of have almost enhanced cooperation in this area. It wouldn't formally be enhanced cooperation, but the same principle applied. Or you can apply a similar approach to what you have in the European Development Fund, the EDF, where member states participate voluntarily. And perhaps by leading in such a way, you can lure other member states to take part as well.
If the European Union is to abandon any attempts to have common policies on primary migration for work purposes, should it not at least aim towards common standards on the admission of dependents, which are the largest number of migrants entering most European countries, including the United Kingdom? And should it not also aim at spreading the adherence to UNHCR guidelines, such as those on the treatment of women and on the LGBTI migrants who come here for asylum? And UNHCR has constantly tried to persuade member states to adopt these guidelines, and to some extent they are incorporated in the immigration rules of this country, but not so much in other European countries. Would that not be an objective that the European Union could aim at?
I'm not familiar with the details of the UNHCR's guidelines, but I mean, in theory, yes. I mean, this is an area where the EU should strive to achieve. I mean, better reception conditions, for example. I mean, that's an obvious one. I mean, of course, there are a few of us that will be against better reception conditions for asylum seekers. So I think that's a very useful forum for the European Union. Now, whether you politically how much you can legislate in common in that area, I don't know. But as an aim, yeah, sure enough.
I think an interesting issue, again, from reading the Swedish minister's evidence, I mean, I think obviously some basic common human rights standards are obviously vital, but he talks about this idea of competition among them, especially in this changed, potentially looking in the future, as Lord Hannay suggested, in this changed demographic situation where the political narrative may have changed, and it'd be more about actually trying to get more labour migrants and so on, and being member states being in competition with each other. I think the point he made was that issues surrounding labour mobility, like around the rights for family members and so on, that may be an incentive for member states to offer more in terms of than other member states in order to attract migrants. So I think that is something that may well happen in due course through that process of kind of the member states that will want to attract migrants may offer better conditions, or may offer wider conditions or wider access for family members and so on, and that may be a way of creating competition within the member states. I don't think necessarily you have to have a uniform approach above and beyond the basic human rights that we all kind of expect. So I think there's no necessary reason why the EU would have to legislate on that basis. I think that you could allow the member states to be in competition if they want to seek labour migrants. That would be potentially quite an effective way of allowing member states to compete with each other.
Have you considered to what extent the demographic problems which are foreseen by some people would be resolved by a reasonably liberal approach to the admission of dependents? Because if the dependents come at a fairly early age, they will be fully trained in the host countries and will acquire the skills that may be exhibiting shortages that would otherwise have to be filled by the admission of primary migrants. So there are very large numbers of these dependents entering all European countries who might be the reservoir from which that demographic hole is filled.
Yeah. Now, I think I tend to agree with Cecilia Malmström, the commissioner in charge on this. In her analysis, when she does say that part of the demographic problem that Europe is facing and will face to a much greater extent in the future can be addressed by more labour migration. That's absolutely right. Now, as I think maybe you can explore in more detail, I think you should be careful with how you use that though, because first, Europe has to be a bit careful in how far it pushes that argument, because it's not in Europe's interest to sort of have people educated in various different countries, have these countries face that cost, and then they just migrate to Europe. I mean, that can achieve kind of brain drain in various quite important countries on Europe's border, for example. That's not in Europe's interest either. Secondly, I would say that it won't solve the entire problem with unfavourable demographics. Of course not. I mean, can only be part of the solution to that. Migrants will get older as well eventually, and Europe will have to boost its own skills, sort of its homegrown skills, if it wants to compete in the global arena as well. So, in principle, it's absolutely correct analysis, and I think that's something that Europe has to look at. And Sweden, for example, is very keen on this. But we also have to be realistic, what it does to potential our neighbourhood, if it leads to brain drain, and B, it can only be part of the solution.
Lord Tomlinson.
Yes, I'd like to refer you back to an argument that Open Europe have in the past made. You know, when you've argued that the UK government pick and mix approach to cooperation in EU asylum policy, now, and I quote, draws a healthy degree of cross-party consensus and should remain in place. Do you believe that this approach either does or could undermine the UK's influence on EU policy developments in this area?
I'll start off on that, and then I hand over to Stephen. I don't necessarily think so. Unlike in many other EU policy areas, for example, the ones relating to the Eurozone crisis, it's not that kind of political momentum behind this for it to really pose a threat to UK influence. It would have been different had this been the kind of policy area that perhaps some people around the table wanted to be, with much more EU involvement and much more sort of momentum behind common EU measures. Then I think it may have been, it would have posed a risk to UK influence. But at the moment, it's just not. It's a bit of I would say, sleeping dog, or at least it's quite passive policy area. So I don't think there's much evidence for that.
But you seem to be arguing earlier that this is an area of policy where the EU, if it did have more power, rather than the dispersal of power between the EU member states, could have a more effective policy.
That's true. I absolutely. That's sort of the theoretical side of it. If that happened, then X would follow. But I think there are so many political hurdles to that actually happening that at the moment it doesn't pose a threat to UK influence, because the politics of it is such that it just won't move in that kind of direction anytime soon, I don't think.
I think, and one more thing I'd add to that in terms of the big picture thing is obviously the UK isn't part of Schengen, so that adds another different dimension to the level of integration the UK is ever going to have in this area of immigration and so on. If it's not going to take part in the Schengen building measures in terms of visa policy and so on, there's always going to be a limit to the influence it can have. And I think on the issue of asylum, it seems that successive governments have taken the view that they've accepted the current standards in terms of reception conditions and human rights standards. But in terms of future integration, it seems that both governments were only interested in the Dublin system, which is effectively a way of moving asylum seekers or asylum seekers from the UK back to the state they first arrived in the EU. So that, again, that's a defensive measure, if you like. And that seems to be one that has cross-party support. And on a practical level, there are obviously issues about how effective that system will be in future, given what the ECJ has ruled in Greece and so on. I think that's something that will have to be looked at in terms of whether that system will actually function in the future. And I think there are also examples where the UK has taken part. I mean, again, it depends on what the objective is. But if you take the government's view, and I think the previous government's view, that the UK's main interest is in about capacity building and defensive measures, most of that comes down to money. And if the UK contributes, I think it will continue to have leverage on those issues if it wants to cooperate on those things. For example, on Frontex, although it isn't formally part of the Frontex structure, it does take part in missions and has cooperated outside of the structures. So I think it depends. I think on the practical level of what the government seems to want to achieve, I think its leverage is still there. And I think influence over other areas that probably seem to be of limited interest to the government. So I think that those are the two aspects to it.
Security policy actually had one of its objectives, which is to make Frontex more effective, which is interesting for a country which isn't actually participating.
No, yeah, that's true. I mean, there's that issue.
But it was very striking.
No, I think
so. I mean, I happen to think that that's a completely correct conclusion to have reached. That Frontex is of real value to this country, because we're not usually the country of first migration. But it is interesting, and what you say is really in support of that.
Indeed, I think.
Yes, Lord Thomas.
If I can ask a supplementary question which slightly widens it. Because I understand exactly what you said now, and that's in the context of asylum seekers. Mm-hmm. But the burden of what I understood from you earlier on was mainly about illegal migration. Mm-hmm. Now, what is the balance of your concerns between asylum seekers and illegal migration, and what do you think is the current trend of illegal migration both into the United Kingdom and into the EU as a whole? We have some statistical information that suggests it's falling and falling quite dramatically.
Illegal immigration.
Illegal immigration. Yeah. Do you accept that, or if not, what do you use as your statistical information?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's not something that we haven't taken. It's not something that we looked at in great detail in terms of the figures So we couldn't really answer the question in any real in confidence, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Can we come back to the question of demographics, which we touched on earlier? Because I think the trends and prospects are that, over time, there will be need for more migration in the light of what's happening demographically. Well, what do you think are the likely consequences of that if popular resistance to immigration level and policies continues? Because, where you were saying earlier that you've been looking at politics of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And, how are you going to square that? You need migration.
Yeah.
And how is it going to square that with the attitudes to migration?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very difficult sell, I'm afraid. And I don't say that with any sort of joy at all, because, we are supporters of migration in many ways. We think it's a good thing. But it's going to be very difficult, and particularly in this economic climate, I think, where we already see some quite unpleasant political parties rising around Europe. And I'm afraid that may continue until we see the end of this crisis. Politicians, I think, have a huge responsibility in this. Just looking at the politics of it, and we do perhaps have a bit of a comparative perspective, from various different individual EU countries. Politicians need to talk about this. They need to explain what's going on. They need to manage it carefully. What the Labour government did, for example, this was of course EU migration, intra-EU migration, but what the Labour government did on not taking the issue seriously of the scale of influx from the new member states, I think was a major mistake. That kind of undermines confidence in migration as a whole, because of course the issues are blurred in the views of the public. So politicians need to talk about it, need to take concerns from individual citizens and communities seriously. And thirdly, need to have a game plan. And I think this is where the Swedish example is quite interesting, because the Swedish government has come out explaining what they're trying to do. They've been transparent, they've been open, and they have reached a sort of consensus, or at least a deal within the Swedish society between the employers and the employees. Although it's not entirely pain-free, at least there's some buy-in from big part of Swedish society for what the Swedish government is trying to do on the labour migration front. And it's also interesting because they are trying to break with this quite complicated immigration model from years past, which have heavily focused on asylum rather than economic migration. So, and I think that has in turn actually perhaps, although it's too early to say, but perhaps it has kind of pushed the anti-immigrant party in that country, the Sweden Democrats, slightly to the sidelines. But it's too early to say. But I think that it will be an interesting one to watch, whether that is a model for how to communicate and sell more migration to your public.
But do you think there's another element to this? Because I think there was a saying, that you wanted labour and human beings arrived. Because in a way, you can look for labour, but in terms of people coming in with a question of dependence, do you think there has to also be a strategy in terms of integration and all of that? Because you can explain all of that, but you need to have some practical strategies.
For integrating the newcomers into society, you mean?
Yes.
You know what? I think that the best tool for integration is the labour market. Mm-hmm. If people can get into the labour market quick, almost immediately, then you can't replace that in terms of assimilation and integration. It's when you have that sort of, if you have a big migrant population which is sort of outside the labour market, or in very sort of small pockets of the labour market doing very sort of a limited number of jobs. I think that's when you have segregation and problems with integration. But of course I do think it is necessary to have at least a basic idea of what kind of integration process you will want to see. But for example, start talking about language requirements before entering the labour market and stuff like that, I think is, of course for some jobs you need that. I mean, doctors, for example, will have to have certain language skills and so forth. But to have to pass like a language test before you can enter the labour market For example, I think it's the wrong approach. I don't think it has worked in Sweden previously. I don't think it will. That should be sector specific rather than as a sort of one size fits all measure. Does that make sense?
It does.
So I do think the labour market is key, and the fewer barrier to enter the labour market quickly and swiftly, the better.
Thank you.
Yes, Lord Avery.
Can I return to the question of dependence? Do you know of any European studies on the contribution that dependence will make in the future to filling the gaps in demography? Because obviously, if children come here to join primary migrants, they will be educated in English, and similarly in the other European countries, they won't have to pass any language test, and they will be fully educated to meet the labour requirements of the home. Those countries. So I wonder if the European Union has made any study whatsoever of the contribution that the dependents might make in the future to filling the labour market requirements that we can foresee.
I'm not aware of any
Do you think it should? Do you think the European Union
I think it's something
should?
that's it's certainly worth looking at, yes. I mean,
Given the number of studies that the Commission produces every year, I think that will be worth it.
Lord Thomas.
Mine was exactly the same question.
Right. Now, Lord Sharkey, I fear your fox has been to some extent shot. But
Well, I'm slightly recovered my fox.
Right.
You have talked quite a lot about Sweden.
Yeah.
But Sweden is a very small country. It has very specific demands and requirements. It's a relatively homogeneous society. And do you think there are any parts of the Swedish model that really are transferable to large member states?
It's a very good question, actually. I think I'm a bit agnostic on that. I think we need more evidence as to what the Swedish model will mean and is what it does to the basic sort of migration trends to Sweden. It's still early days. Remember, it was quite recently when the coalition government in Sweden actually introduced this, so we don't know yet. In principle, I don't see why it would not work in a bigger country if you have a more demand-driven policy on labour migration, where the employer, where business stand more in sort of the centre.
I was thinking rather more of the difficulty in obtaining a consensus amongst the existing population of a large country about accepting the kind of Swedish model.
A political consensus. It's tricky because if you look at Britain, for example, obviously what you have in Britain in terms of economic migration is primarily intra-EU. So in that sense, I think you already basically have a situation in Britain where economic migration is it's complicated and it has created some public backlash, but it's sort of accepted in a way. I mean, it's something that Britain already lives with. Whereas in Sweden, it's actually new. It's basically new. Sweden had it in the 1960s when Southern Europeans came to Sweden. Since then, it's been very asylum-driven. So for this is actually something new in Sweden, whereas in Britain, it's something that has been the case for quite some time. And in the UK, you see it already, sort of, kind of, I think, with non-EU migration, although the quota system, of course, complicates that. So I don't know, to be honest. It's a complicated question in Britain, and immigration is a toxic issue here. It may be difficult, but with the right sell, with the right pitch and the right economic climate, maybe it will work for Britain as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. You recommend that the government seek to negotiate a reversible option in this sector to prevent future governments being bound by the decision of their predecessors. Now, I'm no expert on this, but this seems to strike right at the root of the opt-in and the opt-out procedures. Having said that, do you believe this is a realistic aim, and would it not create significant uncertainty for those covered by the legislation and for other member states?
Well, we actually didn't recommend it as a firm option. We said this is something that could be explored. I think what we said in the report is that this is probably one of the few changes that Britain could make to the current arrangement. Will it be politically difficult to achieve? Absolutely. It will be difficult. Will it lead to uncertainty? Probably. Will it happen? Probably not. But it's certainly something that could be kept in mind and explored as an option to what we have at the moment.
And a little cruel if I suggested, therefore, that your line of argument is that it's a pretty undesirable thing to do, but it's being driven by politics.
The reversible opt-in.
The idea of reversible opt-in, yes. It has no real advantages, practical advantages, other than meeting a particular political demand.
Well, it's giving it. I think the advantage will be giving it more democratic legitimacy. If you can say this is reversible, as if the electorate makes that democratic decision, then this can be reversed. I think that will be the only, with the hope that, if it's a good arrangement, it wouldn't. But I think that is the main advantage. It's just a sort of it's political and democratic buy-in.
I think probably a more important thing that could be done as a priority and within the UK is to have more oversight of the opt-in in the first place, which is something that I'm sure that other committees have looked at and so on. But that's something that we think is very important, is that the government does not have the sole responsibility for opt-ins. It should be a parliamentary decision and go to a vote. I think that would do a lot to improve the democratic legitimacy of decisions to take part in these types of measures, because up to now it has just been a government decision.
No, that's not the case under the agreements that the then Labour government made at the time of Lisbon ratification, which was that opt-ins would be submitted to a parliamentary process which could, up to and including the taking of a vote.
But they're under no obligation.
And we have actually applied it in this House, and they have applied it in the House of Commons as well, where they had a vote quite recently on a government decision about an opt-in. A very small minority voted against, but nevertheless they had a vote. And we had absolutely no opposition at all to our proposal in this House that we should opt in to the Proceeds of Crime Directive. The government didn't do it yet, or has not at this stage done it, but there was a perfectly good parliamentary process. We wrote a report that was debated in the House. It was it's what are called the Ashton and Liddington undertakings on opt-ins, which are now in full force, actually. They may not have been noticed by anyone, but they're there.
Yeah, I mean, so we were very heavily involved in pushing for a greater scrutiny, but it's still the fact that the government is under no obligation to put it to a vote, and we think that should really...
Yes, it is. No, I mean, they've accepted an obligation. They have, if I understand the Ashton and Liddington undertakings, they have accepted that if either house wishes to put their views to a vote, the government will enable time, in government time, the government will and within the time limits laid down for opting in, they will do that.
And if they hadn't have accepted it, Lord Chairman, I think I'm right in saying, as I remember the discussion on that had they not done it, there would have almost certainly been an amendment to the ratification bill, and that would have meant the bill going back to the House of Commons.
Well, it was negotiated between...
So it was negotiated...
Baroness Ashton, who was the leader of the House, and the EU Select Committee here. That was how it happened. But it does strike me from that perhaps you might like to consider doing a little bit more research into how this system... It is evolving all the time. Each instance that comes along is handled in a slightly different way, but it is a live animal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have, believe me, I have looked at this. I'm happy to write to you afterwards, but as I understand it, the language is actually pretty woolly. It's about something about significant parliamentary interest. I think I mean, there's no point arguing it now, but I think that the issue of whether the government is actually obliged to put every opt-in to a vote is still not necessarily certain.
Perhaps I could just without prolonging it, because we must finish now, but point out to you that significant parliamentary interest is in the hands of us, the committees. That's to say, we decide whether we will write a report to the House on an opt-in proposal, not the government. We decide that, and the government has committed itself to the fact that if we write such a report and ask for a debate and ask for a vote, we get it.
That's great. Then the next step is to make it
so it's not. It isn't in the hands of the government.
Okay,
the determination as to whether it's a significant interest is not in the hands of the government. It's in the hands of in this case, of parliamentary committees. The other end is slightly different, but it's a parliamentary committee.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. I still think, as a matter of course, it would be not just also for the process of parliamentary colleagues having to actually face up to the opt-in decisions as they come and actually be aware of them, because unless it is referred to a debate, they won't be aware of them. So I think that as a matter of course, that should be the process. I mean, I guess that's what we're arguing.
What you're asking for is like an affirmative resolution procedure where the government has got to table a resolution and it has to be voted on, irrespective of whether or not the select committee is looked at.
It's very simple. It should be voted on every single time.
Yes.
Would you agree scrutiny of these matters will always be most effective in the context of the level of public information? And the trouble is that I do ask you to consider that the public is ill-served by the media, who totally fail to cover the processes when they're operating in their detail.
Well, I don't think we should. I certainly would criticise Openeurope for that, because you publish a great deal of material, and much of it is very well researched.
Thank you.
And so you are contributing to the public debate, in my view, although I don't share all your views, as you know, in a thoroughly useful fashion. And that's how it should be. But what I draw from this conclusion about the question about the reversible opt-in, is that perhaps when you said that you thought this was a good or a possible idea, you hadn't fully appreciated how much the changes that were introduced at Lisbon actually provide for national parliamentary oversight of this opt-in, opt-out system. Anyway, I'll leave that thought with you, and who knows, you may write another report.
Yeah. No, but I think, to be honest, as a matter of, it's very, very simple. Every single time there's an opt-in, there should be an automatic vote. Yeah. Because as much respect as I have for people in Parliament and peers and MPs, it does take a lot of work to look into this stuff, and I think if you actually have that automatic vote, if you know that it's coming, then it will be subject to the same type of. And if you're talking about media, you know, you can actually have the quite high-profile votes covered by media. But if it's sort of under the radar and someone has to pick up on it for it to be picked on a vote.
I mean, not one newspaper has picked up any of the things that we've done on this in the last 2 years.
No, it's
and yet we've been applying a new system in, I think, a reasonably rigorous way, and will continue to do so.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much for coming along this morning. It's been of great value to us, and I think we've got lots of material from your testimony which will be of use to us. So thank you.
Thanks very much for having us. Thank you.
Committee Room 3, Sound.